Hello, my dear literature enthusiasts. Friends who love not only to watch movies but to feel them, to unspool their inner workings as though they were novels written in light. Today I want to welcome you into a space of reflection and conversation, as if we're sitting together with cups of tea, leaning forward in that way people do when they're eager to share something that touched them deeply. We're going to talk about Mission Impossible, The Final Reckoning 2025. And before we begin, I'll ask you, gently, sincerely, if you find joy in these explorations, if you find them nourishing, please like this video and subscribe. Not out of obligation, but because it helps me know we are building a circle, a community of thoughtful viewers who want to connect cinema with philosophy, memory, and the textures of human experience. And let me say clearly at the outset, this is not a real review of a real film. What follows is a theoretical and critical exercise, a work of imagination and reflection meant for those who come from a background of literature, philosophy, and the humanities. I'm less interested in the mechanics of box office and budgets than in the way stories move through us, shape us, and in turn, how we shape them. So treat this not as a guide to what you will see in theaters, but as a meditation on what such a film could mean, if we dared to look at it through a more literary lens. When I first heard whispers of this imagined final installment, I felt a tug of something bittersweet. There's always a melancholy when we say goodbye to a long story, isn't there? I remember as a child, finishing the last book of a beloved series and closing the cover with trembling hands, feeling both proud to have reached the end and unmoored by the sudden absence of the world I had been living inside. That's the sensation I imagined here. The end of a saga that has defined action cinema for decades, now distilled into something that almost aches with finality. The film itself begins not with explosions, but with silence. This surprised me. There's a quiet confidence in starting an action epic with stillness, as though the creators trusted us to wait, to lean in, to listen. And in that quiet, I found myself thinking about endings, not just in cinema, but in life. How often do we realize the final chapter is upon us only after it has already begun? That opening sequence reminded me of the final day at a job I once loved, when everything looked the same. The same desk, the same clock ticking on the wall. Yet beneath it all, every sound carried the gravity of farewell. The overview of this story, at least in its theoretical form, is deceptively simple. A man who has always run, who has always outwitted fate with speed and daring, is finally confronted with the one mission he cannot outrun, his reckoning. But what makes this story rich is not just the spectacle of it all, but the way it engages with themes of trust, betrayal, loyalty, and the terrifying beauty of closure. You see, what lingers with me is not the machinery of the plot, but the way it feels like a parable, an allegory of how we each wrestle with the parts of ourselves we'd rather not face. The plot, on its surface, unfolds with the rhythm we've come to expect from this saga. The impossible task, the gathering of allies, the lurking traitors, the clock always ticking toward disaster. Yet as I watched, I realized the true suspense wasn't in whether the world would be saved. It always is, but whether the protagonist himself would survive his own truths. That tension reminded me of reading Dostoevsky for the first time, where the real danger was never the external world, but the storm within. One of the early twists, one I won't spoil in full, but I'll tease gently, revolves around the notion of legacy. A message from the past resurfaces, something planted years ago that now blooms like a poisonous flower. When it arrived on screen, I thought instantly of those old letters we sometimes stumble upon in attics or tucked inside books. I once found a letter written by my grandmother, one she had never sent, and reading it felt like a key turning inside me, unlocking a room I hadn't known was there. That's the power this twist carried, the sense that the past is never gone, merely waiting to be reread. The action sequences, of course, dazzle, but in this imaginative exercise, they feel less like stunts and more like metaphors. A character clinging to the side of a burning aircraft doesn't just represent bravery. It embodies the desperation of holding on to something that is slipping away, no matter how impossible the grip. Watching that scene, I couldn't help but recall my own grasp on friendships that were fading, my refusal to let go even when the fire was consuming us. Isn't that what stories do? They give shape to emotions too unwieldy to name. There's also an undercurrent of mortality running throughout the narrative. It is rare, I think, for action cinema to pause long enough to let mortality truly settle in, but here it does. Characters who once seemed untouchable now carry the weight of fragility. There's a rooftop scene, drenched in rain, where two longtime allies exchange words that feel less like strategy and more like a eulogy spoken in advance. As I listened, I was reminded of the last time I sat across from an old friend, both of us knowing we might not see each other again, yet laughing as though nothing had changed. That mingling of sorrow and joy, that's the emotional truth the film captures. Another twist arrives later, not so much shocking as inevitable, and it strikes at the very core of identity. Without giving it away, I'll say it reminded me of the ending of certain Greek tragedies, where the hero realizes that the enemy he has been battling all along is in some way a reflection of himself. That revelation has always unsettled me. When I was younger, I used to imagine my struggles as external villains, bad jobs, bad luck, misunderstandings. But the older I get, the more I recognize that the fiercest battles are internal. This story taps into that unease with startling elegance. What I found most resonant, though, was the sense of reckoning as a universal human experience. We may not leap across rooftops or disable nuclear devices, but we each come to a point where we must face the sum of our choices. Watching this narrative unfold felt like looking into a mirror, albeit a cinematic one. And it left me asking myself, what unfinished threads in my life am I still avoiding? What final missions have I been postponing because I fear the reckoning they will bring? The finale, without revealing too much, manages to be both thrilling and intimate. It's the paradox I admire most in storytelling, the ability to give us spectacle while simultaneously whispering something personal into our hearts. There is an image at the end, fleeting yet unforgettable, that I cannot shake. It felt like an ellipsis rather than a period, the kind of ending that invites us not to close the book, but to keep rereading it in our minds. And isn't that the greatest gift a story can give? As the credits rolled, I felt a mix of satisfaction and longing, like finishing a profound novel and sitting in silence afterward, unwilling to break the spell. It reminded me of when I first read The Brothers Karamazov in college, how I couldn't speak for hours afterward, only sit with the magnitude of what I had just encountered. This imagined film, in its own way, carried that same weight for me. So, my friends, as we prepare to dive deeper into the layers of this story in the next parts of our exploration, I want to thank you for being here with me in this moment. Thank you for allowing me to share not just an analysis, but a piece of myself, my memories, my reflections, my small reckonings. If you've enjoyed this journey so far, please remember to like and subscribe, not as a transaction, but as a gesture of companionship on this road of ideas. Together, we can continue to bridge the world of cinema with the enduring power of literature. And I leave you with this thought. Perhaps the real impossible mission in any story is not the saving of the world, but the saving of the self. Perhaps that is the final reckoning we all must face, in art as in life. I remember the first time the lights dimmed and the opening scenes unfolded, how there was that hush of anticipation in the room, a silence so complete it felt almost ceremonial. That's how it begins, with stillness, with absence, with the camera lingering on a space where we expect noise, action, propulsion, and instead are offered quiet. A long corridor, empty, washed in sterile light, the hum of fluorescent bulbs echoing. At first, it feels unsettling, almost claustrophobic, as though the world itself is holding its breath. And perhaps that's the point, to remind us that even in stories built on motion, there must be stillness before the storm. The first figure we see isn't the hero rushing in, but a stranger, a technician in an abandoned facility, his face drawn, his body tense. He carries something in his hands, small and unremarkable at first glance, but the way he clutches it, the desperation in his eyes, makes it clear it is anything but ordinary. He pauses in the corridor, glances at the shadows, and whispers a name under his breath. A name we don't yet understand, but which hangs in the air like a key waiting to turn in some unseen lock. That moment reminded me of when I once discovered a scrap of paper tucked inside a second-hand book I had bought at a flea market. On it, in neat handwriting, someone had written only a single name, nothing else. I remember wondering who that person was, what story they belonged to, whether they had been lost or left behind. That same feeling washed over me here. The sense that the smallest fragment can carry the weight of an entire hidden narrative. The camera then shifts, and finally, at last, the familiar presence of our central figure arrives. Not with bravado, not with the usual frenetic momentum, but with a weary kind of grace. He enters a world already in motion, already fractured, and what strikes me most is not his strength, but his solitude. His face, weathered by years of running, searching, saving, carries an expression I had not seen in him before. Doubt. A rare vulnerability, as though he, too, is aware that time is running out, not just on the mission, but on himself. The early movements of the story carry a rhythm almost like chess. Pieces are positioned, alliances suggested, suspicions hinted at. There's a meeting in a dimly lit cafe, one of those European spaces where marble floors echo and the scent of strong coffee lingers in the air. He sits across from an ally we've known for years, someone who has been both confidant and conscience. Their conversation flows with the ease of old comrades, yet beneath it runs a current of unease. Words are exchanged about a signal intercepted, a message resurrected from the digital ether, something thought destroyed long ago. That idea, that the past is never truly erased, lands heavily. I thought of the old laptop I once opened after years of it gathering dust, only to find forgotten journals, fragments of myself I had once believed buried. There is something haunting about encountering a version of yourself you thought you'd left behind. That's what this intercepted message feels like. The voice of the past returning, insistent, demanding to be heard. From here, the pace begins to quicken. The message reveals a conspiracy, not fully extinguished, a seed of destruction planted years before that now begins to bloom. To chase it down requires crossing borders, both geographic and moral, and the first set piece transports us to a city bathed in rain. Cobblestones glisten, neon reflects in puddles, and through narrow alleyways the chase begins. But this isn't spectacle for spectacle's sake, it's layered with emotion. As he runs, dodging, climbing, grasping, there is a sense of a man being chased not only by enemies, but by his own past decisions. There's one moment in that chase that struck me deeply. He leaps onto a rooftop, pauses for the briefest of seconds, and glances at the horizon. It's a look not of calculation but of hesitation, almost as though he is considering whether to keep running at all. Watching it, I thought of times in my own life when I paused mid-journey, not because I was physically tired, but because I wondered if the path itself was worth continuing. That second of hesitation says more about his inner turmoil than 100 words could. The chase culminates in a narrow escape, but at a cost. A trusted companion, someone who has been with him for years, is wounded. The injury is not fatal, yet it is a stark reminder that time spares no one, that even the most resilient bodies falter. There's a scene afterward, in a safe house lit only by flickering lamps, where the wounded ally lies on a makeshift cot, whispering words half in pain, half in defiance. Their banter is tinged with humor, but it carries the heaviness of people who have shared too many battles to deny the truth anymore. This section of the story pivots on relationships. It's not only about missions and explosions, but about the fragile web of trust that holds people together. A new figure is introduced here, a mysterious operative whose allegiance remains unclear. The first time they appear, it is in shadow, their voice soft but cutting, their words carefully chosen to both reveal and conceal. I felt a flicker of recognition, that sense you get when you meet someone for the first time, yet feel you've known them forever. But here, the familiarity is unsettling, because it suggests that the past is looping back, repeating itself in new forms. There's a dinner scene where all these characters gather, an uneasy truce, fragile as glass. The table is laid with silver cutlery, fine wine, the veneer of civility. Yet beneath it, every glance is weighted, every word a maneuver. I couldn't help but be reminded of family gatherings where unspoken tensions simmer beneath polite conversation, where the clink of glasses masks the thunder of secrets. The dinner ends abruptly, of course, a betrayal revealed, and suddenly the civility shatters into chaos. From there, the narrative carries us into more dangerous terrain. Mountains this time, jagged and snow-covered, landscapes that mirror the starkness of the choices to be made. The mission now is clear: retrieve the fragment of data that could either save or doom millions. Yet it isn't just data. It's a mirror to the past, tied to a decision made years before that still haunts the protagonist. The ascent up the mountain is grueling, filmed with a rawness that conveys not just physical strain, but existential weight. I thought of long hikes I've taken, the way each step felt like a negotiation between body and will, how the summit was never just a place, but a metaphor for survival. In the heart of the mountain lies the first true confrontation, a vault hidden beneath ice, guarded not only by technology, but by ideology. Here, the protagonist must face not an army, but an idea, that everything he has sacrificed may have been in vain. The dialogue exchanged in this scene is sharp, filled with paradoxes. One adversary claims that in trying to save the world, he has only bound it tighter in chains. That accusation lingers, heavier than any physical blow. What follows is both action and meditation, a desperate fight in the cold, each punch echoing like a question. What does it mean to save, and who decides what salvation looks like? By the time the vault is breached, the characters are more wounded by words than by weapons. Inside, the fragment is found, a simple drive, unassuming, yet charged with all the gravity of fate. When he holds it in his hand, there's no triumph on his face, only sorrow. Because he knows, as we do, that every discovery carries the seed of its own destruction. As the first half draws toward its midpoint, tension crescendos. The team, fractured yet still bound together by necessity, must flee. The mountains collapse around them in an avalanche, a visual metaphor for the chaos that has been unleashed. In those tumbling moments of white and noise, I found myself holding my breath, not just for their survival, but for what it meant symbolically, that once momentum is set in motion, it cannot be stopped. They emerge battered but alive, their prize secured, yet their unity shaken. And here, in a quiet moment by a fire in the ruins of an abandoned cabin, the protagonist sits apart from the others, staring into the flames. His reflection flickers with the firelight, his eyes carrying the weight of centuries of struggle condensed into one man's face. And I thought then of my own quiet nights by fires, when the world seemed too vast and my choices too small, when I wondered if anything I did truly mattered. That's what this scene captures, the haunting question of meaning itself. And then, just before the first great turning point, a revelation drops like a stone into still water. A name is spoken, the same name whispered in that opening corridor. The threads converge, the past reaches into the present, and suddenly everything we thought we understood fractures. It is not merely a mission anymore. It is personal, it is ancestral, it is mythic. That's where the first movement of the story leaves us. Not with answers, but with questions echoing louder than any explosion. The fire crackles in that ruined cabin, the faces of the weary illuminated in its glow, each of them marked by silence more than speech. There's a heaviness to the air, as though the walls themselves are listening, bearing witness to the burden of secrets finally pressing to the surface. I remember the way the camera lingered on his face, the protagonist's face, as though it was no longer the face of a man, but of history itself, etched by choices and mistakes too numerous to count. That's where the story carried me deeper, into the marrow of its heart. From the ashes of that fire, the mission pushes forward. The recovered drive, the fragment of the past, becomes both weapon and wound, something that could save countless lives, yet also destroy them if it falls into the wrong hands. Already fractured by mistrust, the team debates what to do next. It is here that fault lines truly widen. Old allies question his judgment, whispering whether his instincts are clouded by ghosts he refuses to let go. A new tension takes root, quieter than bullets, but sharper than knives. The question of whether the leader they've trusted for so long is still capable of leading at all. There is a journey southward now, into a city suffused with color and chaos, a stark contrast to the white stillness of the mountains. The streets teem with people, markets alive with sound, and yet beneath the surface is the same sense of lurking danger. In this city, everything feels doubled. Every friendly smile could be a mask, every shadow might conceal a betrayer. The protagonist moves through it with caution, but also with a trace of weariness, as though he knows that the true enemies aren't just in the alleys, but within the circle itself. One scene I remember vividly unfolds in a crowded marketplace. He and the mysterious operative, whose allegiance has remained uncertain, slip into the press of bodies, pursued by unseen watchers. The camera captures fleeting glances, snatches of color, the sound of bells ringing in the distance. It's disorienting, dizzying, like being caught in the tide of memory itself. At one moment, the operative takes his hand, not in romance, but in urgency, and for the briefest instant, there's a spark of trust. It reminded me of moments in my own life, when I found myself leaning on strangers, drawn into fragile alliances that lasted only as long as necessity demanded. That fragile intimacy is what gives the chase its heartbeat. But the chase is not the twist. The twist comes when they finally reach the safe house, when the drive is set upon the table, and the data unlocked. What unfolds on the screen is not just a set of coordinates or codes, but a revelation that cuts deeper than any mission has before. The whisper from the opening corridor, the name spoken in fear, emerges again, now tied directly to the protagonist's own past. It is not the name of an enemy, as we had thought, but someone far more intimate, a ghost tethered to his own story. The one he believed long dead is, in fact, alive, and has been orchestrating the pieces from the shadows. That revelation lands with devastating weight. I recall gasping quietly, the way one does not out of surprise alone, but out of recognition. Because haven't we all at some point discovered that the thing haunting us was not what we thought it was? That the enemy, the obstacle, was not external but deeply personal? It reminded me of when I uncovered truths about my own family. Histories concealed for decades, whispered secrets that reframed everything I thought I knew. The disorientation of realizing your past has been written by unseen hands. That's the feeling this twist evoked. From there, the story shifts tone. The action doesn't vanish. It heightens, but it is colored now by grief, by betrayal, by the aching knowledge that this final mission is not about saving faceless millions, but about confronting someone once loved. The antagonist, revealed as this resurrected figure, begins to move openly now, wielding not only power but memory as a weapon. Messages arrive, taunts laced with personal recollections only someone intimately close could know. Every word is a blade, every gesture a reminder that reckoning is not only about justice, but about the wounds we never healed. There's a confrontation staged in an opera house, of all places. The grandeur of the setting, a chandelier shimmering above, velvet seats stretching into the dark, contrasts with the raw violence unfolding. Yet it isn't the fight itself that struck me, but the interludes of stillness within it. At one moment, the music swells, drowning out the shouts and gunfire, and all we see are the eyes of two figures locked together, one pleading, one condemning. It felt less like a battle of fists than a battle of memory, each strike echoing with a decade of unspoken words. I thought of arguments with people I once loved, the way every sentence carried not only the present hurt, but the accumulated weight of years. That's what this battle felt like, a decade's worth of silence shattering in minutes. The aftermath leaves the team splintered further. The mysterious operative reveals a truth of their own, aligning not with enemy or ally, but with their own personal vendetta. Suddenly, it becomes clear that every figure around the protagonist carries a different motive, a different wound. What binds them is not loyalty but necessity, and even that thread is fraying. Sitting in the dark of the theater, I realized how much this mirrored life itself. How so many of our connections are fragile, conditional, built on moments of mutual need rather than unshakable bonds. And yet, somehow, those fragile ties are what hold us together through storms. The next act carries us into exile, into deserts vast and unforgiving. The sand stretches endlessly, a mirror of the protagonist's own isolation. Here, stripped of allies, pursued by enemies, he faces himself in solitude. There's a haunting sequence where he walks alone through the dunes, the sun bearing down mercilessly, visions of the past flickering in the heat. Ghosts appear, faces of those lost, voices carried on the wind. It is surreal, dreamlike, yet utterly human. I thought of times I have wandered alone, not through deserts, but through my own silence, replaying voices of the past that refuse to fade. The desert becomes not just a landscape, but a metaphor for the barren spaces of memory, where one must confront not the world, but oneself. It is in this desert that another twist unfurls, not in action, but in confession. A message hidden within the drive reveals that the enemy's plan is not destruction for destruction's sake, but an attempt at a new order, one built on control and fear. And the cruelest part is that it was born from the protagonist's own choices, his own past decisions sowing the seeds of this nightmare. The reckoning is no longer about stopping another. It is about facing his own complicity. That revelation struck me deeply, because it mirrored the way we often discover our present struggles are shaped by our own actions, by choices we once thought noble, but that carried unforeseen consequences. The desert gives way to the sea, the narrative moving with the inevitability of tide. The climax approaches in waves. A fortress rises on the coast, both literal and symbolic, where the final confrontation must occur. As the team regathers, bruised but unbroken, there is a sense of inevitability, like actors stepping onto a stage already set by fate. They infiltrate the fortress in silence, shadows weaving between stone walls. And in those quiet moments, I felt my heart beat faster, not for the spectacle, but for the knowledge that everything was converging, that the reckoning was at hand. The final confrontation is not simple, nor is it clean. It is messy, chaotic, filled with betrayals and sacrifices. One ally falls, their last words both mundane and profound, a reminder that in the end, what matters is not the mission but the bonds we form along the way. Another reveals their true allegiance, aligning with the enemy, only to waver at the last moment. These betrayals, these shifting loyalties, feel less like plot devices than reflections of human nature itself. How often we falter, how often we change sides within our own hearts. And then at last, the meeting. Protagonist and antagonist, bound not by ideology alone, but by blood, by memory, by the shared fabric of their past. Their dialogue cuts deeper than any weapon. One argues for control, for order built from sacrifice, the other for freedom, even if it means chaos. Yet beneath their words is something simpler: grief. Grief for what they once were, grief for what was lost. The fight that follows is not the grand choreography we might expect. It is raw, desperate, almost clumsy, two figures grappling not just with each other, but with the weight of years. At one moment, the protagonist spares the other, and in that choice lies the essence of the story. Not destruction, but mercy. Yet mercy carries its own price. The antagonist, in their final breath, triggers the collapse of the fortress, ensuring that the reckoning consumes them both. The escape is harrowing, the survivors barely clawing their way back into the light. And when they emerge battered and broken, there is no sense of triumph, only of survival. The world is saved, yes, but at a cost too heavy to measure. The closing scene is quiet. No parades, no speeches, just the protagonist alone once more, walking through a crowded street. People pass him without recognition, unaware of the battles fought in their name. He pauses, looks up at the sky, and for the first time in the story he smiles, not with joy, but with release. A reckoning faced, a burden laid down. That smile lingered with me long after the credits rolled. Because it wasn't just his smile, it was ours. The smile of anyone who has faced their ghosts and lived to tell the tale. The characters lingered with me long after the story's final frame, not as figures in an action spectacle, but as echoes, as if they had brushed against my own life in ways I couldn't quite shake. They were not only agents in a plot but mirrors, fragments of archetypes and intimate truths. Each one seemed less like an invention of cinema, and more like someone I had once known, perhaps in reality, perhaps only in memory. The central figure, of course, stands at the heart of it all. What fascinated me was not his strength or his skill. Those have been constants through the saga, but the quiet erosion that time has etched upon him. His face carries lines that are more than age. They are the cartography of regret. He is a man built on speed, on momentum, and yet in this story, he is slowed, not by enemies, but by his own reflection. I watched him pause in moments where once he would have rushed ahead, hesitate when once he would have leapt without thought. That hesitation spoke volumes. It reminded me of the first time I realized my own body was not infinite, when I could no longer sprint across a field with the same abandon as my youth. That dawning awareness, that our capacities, once limitless, do narrow, gives him a humanity more profound than any explosion ever could. What makes him compelling here is not his perfection, but his fracture. He is haunted not only by enemies, but by the weight of his choices. In him I see the archetypal tragic hero, not unlike those who populate Greek dramas. Odysseus with his cunning, but also Oedipus with his inevitable confrontation with self. Yet he is also deeply modern, carrying within him the burden of the professional, the cost of a life spent in pursuit of duty. His reckoning, in the end, is not simply with the antagonist, but with the man he has been all along. The wounded ally, the one injured in that rooftop chase, holds a different place in the constellation. For years, he has been both foil and anchor, someone who reminds the protagonist of what loyalty looks like when stripped of grandeur. I found myself watching him closely, not during the fights, but in the quieter moments, where his humor surfaced through pain, where his defiance was less about bravado than about love. There's a tenderness in his loyalty that stirred memories in me of friendships tested over years, of those who stayed even when the storms grew unbearable. He is less an action figure than a reminder that endurance is its own kind of courage. Then there is the mysterious operative, a figure cloaked in ambiguity, a shifting shadow whose allegiance seems to flicker with the wind. I found myself both distrusting and drawn to them, just as the protagonist was. They embodied something archetypal. The trickster, the one who unsettles the boundaries of ally and enemy, who forces the hero to confront not only danger but doubt. What intrigued me most was the way their presence unsettled the protagonist's certainty, introducing vulnerability, not through threat of violence, but through the possibility of intimacy. They held his hand in that crowded market, and in that gesture I sensed a depth of humanity that no allegiance could erase. It reminded me of those strange connections we form in life, fleeting, fragile, sometimes unreliable, but no less real. The antagonist, revealed to be someone deeply bound to the protagonist's own history, carried the story's heaviest weight. What struck me most was not their cruelty, though it was evident, nor their genius, though it was formidable, but their grief. Beneath their rhetoric of control and power, there pulsed a wound. The wound of abandonment, of betrayal, of love curdled into resentment. Watching them, I thought of how often the fiercest anger I have encountered in others was merely grief transfigured, sorrow unable to find expression except in destruction. Their confrontation in the opera house, eyes locked across the music, felt less like a duel of ideology, and more like the final chapter of a love story gone to ruin. That's what made the antagonists so haunting. They were not alien, not monstrous, but achingly familiar, a reflection of what happens when pain is allowed to calcify unchecked. The secondary characters, too, resonated in unexpected ways. The confidant at the cafe, with whom the protagonist shares coffee and words heavy with implication, reminded me of mentors I've known. Those who appear at crucial junctures to remind us of truths we'd rather ignore. Their role is not to save, but to nudge, to point the way, to act as a conscience externalized. And when their guidance falters, when even they seem unsure, it underscores the loneliness of leadership. Even the nameless technician in the opening corridor, clutching that object with trembling hands, became symbolic in my memory. Though he vanishes quickly, his whispered name is the thread that binds the story, the fragile seed from which everything grows. I thought of him often, perhaps because he embodies the truth that even the smallest players leave ripples. In literature, I have always been drawn to minor characters who vanish after a page or two, yet whose presence alters the trajectory of everything. This technician is one of those, forgotten by the plot, remembered by the audience, the ghost at the feast. What unites all these characters, in my mind, is that they are less defined by what they do than by what they reveal. Each one uncovers a different facet of the protagonist. The ally reveals his capacity for loyalty, the operative his vulnerability, the antagonist his complicity, the confidant his doubt, the minor figures his dependence on chance and fate. It is as though he is a prism, and they are the light passing through, illuminating the many colors of his humanity. The relationships themselves are where the story breathes most deeply. The friendship with the wounded ally is written in gestures more than words. A shared glance, a half-smile in the face of despair. The tension with the operative is less about strategy than about intimacy deferred, possibility never fully realized. And the bond with the antagonist is so thick with history it feels almost mythic, like Cain and Abel, or Jacob wrestling the angel, love and hate intertwined, indistinguishable. I found myself thinking of my own relationships, the ones that defy easy categorization, where affection and resentment blur until I cannot tell which is which. That's what makes these dynamics so believable. They are contradictions, as we are. What lingers most for me is how the story refuses to let any character be merely what they seem. The ally is not just loyal. He is also weary, questioning whether the fight is still worth it. The operative is not just duplicitous. They are also lonely, seeking connection even as they betray. The antagonist is not just cruel. They are also wounded, crying out for acknowledgement. Each character is a paradox, and in that paradox they become real. There is a moment near the end, after the fortress collapses, when the surviving characters sit together in silence. No words are exchanged, yet everything is said. The allies' eyes meet the protagonists', and in that look there is no triumph, only exhaustion, but also love. The operative sits apart, their face unreadable, yet in the set of their shoulders one senses regret. And the absence of the antagonist fills the space like a presence, the way the silence of someone gone can be louder than any voice. That tableau captured for me the essence of the film's character study. Survival is never clean, never without scars, never without ghosts. The final image of the protagonist walking alone through the crowded street encapsulates it all. He is surrounded by people yet utterly solitary, anonymous among strangers, yet carrying within him the entire weight of the story. That image felt like the truest character analysis of all. We are each alone in our reckonings, even when the world bustles around us unaware. I thought of the times I have walked through busy streets carrying invisible burdens, the way the noise of the crowd felt like both a comfort and an erasure. That duality is the heartbeat of his character. Hero to the world, stranger to himself. In the end, the characters here are not archetypes but reflections, refracted pieces of the human condition. They remind me that stories endure not because of spectacle, but because of faces, voices, gestures that feel like our own. What I carry from them is not their victories or defeats, but their humanity, the fractures, the hesitations, the ghosts they wrestled. And perhaps that is the true gift of cinema, when viewed through the lens of literature. It offers us not answers, but mirrors, allowing us to see ourselves in the flicker of another's story. What has always fascinated me about cinema is not just what we see on the screen, but the invisible world behind it, the accidents, the coincidences, the small miracles and misfortunes that shape the final story in ways we never expect. When I think of this film, I don't only recall the chases across rooftops or the confrontations in rain-soaked streets. I remember the stories whispered afterward, the strange little details that make the act of creation feel almost as mysterious as the narrative itself. One of the strangest facts I stumbled upon was about the opening sequence, the long, sterile corridor with its flickering fluorescent lights. It looks so deliberate, so composed, as though the emptiness had been crafted with great intention. Yet the truth is it wasn't meant to look like that at all. The production had rented an abandoned government building for a single night's shoot, but when they arrived, the power grid malfunctioned. Only one hallway had partial electricity, and the overhead bulbs hummed and flickered like dying stars. Instead of delaying the shoot, the director insisted they roll the cameras exactly as it was. What was meant to be an inconvenience became the haunting opening image that set the tone for everything. I think of that often, how flaws, if embraced, can become beauty. It reminds me of a watercolor painting I once ruined by spilling coffee across it, only to discover that the stain gave the picture a depth I could never have achieved by design. Another oddity involves the snow-covered mountain sequence. Those jagged peaks, those avalanches that seemed almost too violent to be real, they were, in fact, real. The production had initially planned to film in a controlled environment with simulated snow, but a freak storm swept across the location just as the crew arrived. Instead of halting, they leaned into it. The actors trudged through genuine blizzards, their faces raw from the cold, their exhaustion authentic. I remember reading that one of the cameras actually froze mid-take, the lens fogging with ice, yet the footage captured up to that point was so powerful they kept it in the final cut. When I saw that scene, I remember thinking, yes, this looks too brutal to be staged. And it was. Sometimes nature itself insists on being part of the story. The opera house confrontation hides its own strangeness. That location, grand, gilded, drenched in velvet, was in fact scheduled for renovation. The production negotiated only a handful of days inside, but what's remarkable is how the acoustics began playing tricks on the crew. Microphones picked up whispers from the farthest corners, conversations thought private carried across the entire stage. Actors claimed they could hear the sound of their own breath echoing back seconds later, like a ghostly chorus. One performer said it felt less like a theater and more like a cathedral haunted by its own memories. And perhaps that is why the confrontation in that space feels so uncanny, so otherworldly. The building itself was performing alongside them. Then there's the desert sequence, one of the most visually stunning portions of the film, which nearly never existed. Originally, the script called for a dense urban chase instead. But when the crew scouted a desert location for a minor transitional shot, something about the emptiness captured the director's imagination. He ordered entire rewrites on the spot. What's even stranger is how the desert seemed to resist them. Equipment failed in the heat, sandstorms swallowed entire sets overnight, and in one notorious incident, the main vehicle buried itself axle-deep in sand less than an hour before filming. And yet, those obstacles forced the team into improvisation, shooting scenes on foot, crafting imagery of the protagonist wandering alone that became some of the most memorable moments of the film. Watching those frames, I thought of how absence, emptiness, can speak louder than spectacle. It felt like the land itself had reshaped the story. The strangest fact of all, though, lies not in landscapes but in people. The antagonist, the ghost from the protagonist's past, was played by an actor who had initially refused the role outright. They claimed it was too personal, too heavy, that the idea of embodying betrayal of that magnitude unsettled them. But weeks later, after the production had all but moved on, the actor had a dream. In it, they were standing on a stage, speaking words that were not theirs, and behind them, the audience was weeping. They woke up and called the director the very next morning, saying simply, "I understand now." That dream became the seed of their performance, infusing every line with an eerie conviction. I can't explain it, but when I watched their scenes, I felt that same otherworldly presence, as though some subconscious current had indeed flowed through them into the film. And yet, for all these grand stories, the strangest details are sometimes the smallest. Like the dinner sequence, with its gleaming cutlery and brittle civility. During filming, The actors were instructed to actually eat and drink, not to pretend. What they didn't know was that each had been served slightly different meals, some heavily spiced, others sweet, others bland. The director wanted to capture genuine, unpredictable reactions. The flicker of surprise, the twitch of discomfort, the smile of delight. Those subtle, unscripted moments, someone choking slightly, another pausing too long before swallowing, made the scene bristle with authenticity. When I learned this afterward, I laughed softly, remembering dinners of my own, where the food itself seemed to betray the mood of the evening. There's also the story of the safe house scene, where the wounded ally lies on a cot in flickering lamplight. The flicker, it turns out, wasn't artificial. The generator powering the lights kept failing, plunging the set into darkness mid-scene. The director refused to stop rolling, urging the actors to continue through the malfunctions. That's why the shadows danced so unpredictably in that moment, because the power was literally dying around them. What could have been? Disaster became poetry. And then there's the strangest superstition. Throughout filming, crew members began noticing that whenever a scene involving betrayal was shot, something went wrong with the equipment. Lenses cracked, film jammed, hard drives corrupted. They started calling it the curse of the reckoning. Rational explanations exist. Overuse of equipment, harsh environments. But still, the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Some on set whispered that the story itself didn't want to be told, that it resisted exposure, that every narrative about ghosts and reckonings carries its own shadow. I don't know if I believe that, but I do know that when I watched those betrayal scenes, there was a rawness in them that felt almost too real, as though the story was bleeding through the screen. One of my favorite odd details involves the crowded marketplace chase. Extras were instructed to behave naturally, but the crew didn't fully clear the area. So many of the people we see are not actors at all, but ordinary passers-by, caught unaware that a chase was happening around them. Their startled expressions are genuine. In fact, one man carrying groceries genuinely collided with the protagonist during a take, spilling oranges across the cobblestones. It was unplanned, yet the actor didn't break stride, weaving the accident seamlessly into the scene. The director later said that was the shot they kept. Watching it, I remember smiling at the chaos of it, the way accidents can become art, the way life insists on intruding into fiction. And here's another peculiar fact. The score for the film was partially composed using instruments built from scrap metal found on location. A sound designer, wandering through the ruins of an abandoned factory used for one set, began striking rusted pipes and recording the echoes. Those metallic groans became the foundation of certain themes in the soundtrack. When I listen closely to the music, I hear not just melody but memory, the sound of decay woven into the heartbeat of the story. It reminds me of times I have tapped rhythms on old radiators or fences, marveling at how even discarded objects can sing. Even the final image of the protagonist walking anonymously through a street carries its own behind-the-scenes strangeness. That shot was filmed guerrilla style, with hidden cameras, no extras, no controlled set. The actor simply walked through a real city crowd, unseen, unrecognized. The people around him are not acting. They are living, unaware they are part of a farewell. That anonymity gives the scene its uncanny authenticity. The hero of the story dissolving into the world of ordinary people, becoming just another face in the crowd. When I learned this, it deepened my appreciation. Because isn't that, in some way, what happens to all of us? Our greatest reckonings known only to ourselves, while the world rushes on indifferent. Some facts veer into the realm of the uncanny. During editing, a reel of footage was misplaced, entire days of work gone without explanation. Weeks later, it was discovered in a box mislabeled and stored in a completely different building. The odd part is that when they reviewed the footage, subtle glitches appeared. Faint shadows where no one had been, whispers on the audio track too faint to decipher. Most dismissed it as technical error, but a few swore it felt like the film itself was haunted by its own themes. I don't know what to make of that, but I can't help but shiver when I think of it. And finally, there is the strangest fact of all. Despite the chaos, the malfunctions, the storms, the accidents, the betrayals, not a single day of filming went over schedule. For a project of such magnitude, that is unheard of. It was as though time itself bent to allow this story to be told, as though the universe, in all its cruelty and coincidence, wanted this reckoning to be shared. When I step back and think of all these facts, what stays with me is not just the strangeness but the beauty of imperfection. This film, in all its imagined grandeur, was shaped as much by accidents as by intention. The flickering lights, the blizzards, the echoes, the spilled oranges, the haunted reels, all of them conspired to create something far richer than what was written on the page. And that, I think, is the secret heartbeat of art. It is never wholly ours. It belongs also to chance, to failure, to the stubborn insistence of the world itself. In that sense, the strangest fact about this movie is not any single anecdote, but the simple truth that it exists at all, that a story this fractured and haunted could somehow coalesce into something whole. Watching it, I felt not just the crafted beauty of cinema, but the messiness of life itself, the accidents, the betrayals, the laughter, the ghosts. And perhaps that's why it lingers, because behind the spectacle lies a reminder that the strangest truths are often the most human. There's a peculiar stillness that settles over a story when you step back and examine it, not as a viewer chasing spectacle, but as a reader, as a thinker tracing the architecture beneath the surface. That is how I approached this film, lingering over its events, allowing each moment to unfold, and letting its weight settle in my mind. It is tempting to measure cinema in terms of stunts and explosions, but what truly lingers is the emotional and thematic resonance. The way individual sequences carry echoes of human experience that continue after the lights have gone out. Take, for instance, the rooftop chase in the first act. On the surface, it is pure adrenaline, a man leaping across buildings, pursued relentlessly by unseen forces. But seen through a critical lens, it becomes more than a spectacle. It becomes a meditation on isolation and choice. Every leap, every grasp at ledge and railing, mirrors the protagonist's inner life. Here is a man constantly suspended between past decisions and present consequences, teetering on the edge of failure, yet propelled by necessity. In literature, one often finds such moments in poetry or prose where the external landscape mirrors the internal struggle. The storm at sea, the cliff edge, the encroaching darkness. The rooftop sequence is no different. It is as though the city itself has become a reflection of the mind, jagged, precarious, full of peril. What struck me critically about this chase, and much of the early story, is the way tension is layered. It is not only the immediate threat of falling or being caught, but the underlying dread that every action carries a consequence. This mirrors the ethical philosophy that permeates the narrative, that heroism is never without moral ambiguity. By the time the protagonist reaches the next safe point, we are left contemplating not the triumph of physical skill, but the fragility of human endurance. That is a subtlety too often overlooked in the spectacle of action cinema. The sequences in the snow-covered mountains provide another layer of critical depth. Beyond their aesthetic grandeur, they serve as symbolic terrain. The mountains are not simply obstacles. They are metaphors for history, memory, and the weight of the past pressing upon the present. Every step through the snow is a confrontation with the self. Endurance, regret, perseverance, and fear all compressed into the physical act of climbing. Critically, one might see these sequences as echoing the romantic notion of the sublime, where nature overwhelms, humbles, and teaches through its sheer immensity. The film uses this aesthetic not only to thrill but to provoke reflection. The external landscape becomes an extension of inner life. I thought of my own hikes through mountains as a student, the way every ascent felt both liberating and punishing, and I realized that cinema, at its best, can evoke that same intimate blend of awe and struggle. The opera house confrontation, one of the story's most visually and emotionally striking moments, carries critical significance beyond its immediate drama. Here, the antagonist's motives crystallize not through action alone, but through dialogue layered with history and betrayal. Critically, this is where the film's theme of moral reckoning reaches its apex. It is easy to see villains and heroes as opposites, but the film blurs these lines, suggesting that our most formidable adversaries are often those reflections of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. The opera house itself becomes a character, its echoes and shadows amplifying the moral weight of the confrontation. By examining this scene critically, one sees the narrative's insistence on the interdependence of environment and psyche. Architecture, sound, and performance converge to heighten the ethical and emotional stakes. The desert sequences, too, invite critical attention. Stripped of allies and technology, the protagonist is forced into solitude, confronting the consequences of his past in the rawest terms. It is here that the film's meditation on mortality and human limitation becomes most apparent. The desert is vast, empty, indifferent, an existential mirror reflecting the protagonist's isolation. Every struggle to traverse it, every mirage of hope or threat, reinforces the thematic resonance. Life is a terrain navigated not only with skill, but with conscience and courage. From a literary standpoint, it evokes the deserts of allegorical fiction, from Bunyan to Kafka, where the physical environment acts as both obstacle and teacher. Critically, the desert reminds us that the story's true tension is not only external but ethical. Survival demands not just action but reflection. The drive itself, the recovered fragment of the past, serves as a narrative anchor, but its critical importance lies in its symbolic function. It represents memory, guilt, and the inescapable consequences of prior choices. Every character's interaction with it reveals character, motives, and hidden histories. In this sense, the object is less a MacGuffin than a mirror, reflecting what each character fears, desires, and ultimately becomes. For the protagonist, it is a confrontation with his own complicity and the latent consequences of heroism pursued at all costs. Critically, this elevates the narrative. It is not merely about stopping destruction, but about ethical accountability. The film, at its most nuanced, asks the audience to weigh not only outcomes but decisions, reminding us that narrative stakes are measured not in explosions, but in moral consequence. The antagonist's arc, revealed gradually, carries profound critical weight. Their insistence on control, born from personal grievance and historical betrayal, forces the protagonist to confront the cost of his past choices. Critically, this character operates as both antagonist and foil. Their actions illuminate the protagonist's moral dilemmas, forcing reflection on responsibility, sacrifice, and the limits of intervention. It is striking how the film avoids caricature. The antagonist is not evil for spectacle but complex, a character forged in pain and shaped by circumstance. From a critical perspective, this blurring of moral boundaries is where the film's intellectual resonance is strongest, engaging not only emotions but thought, asking the audience to grapple with ambiguity. The crowded marketplace sequence, often remembered for its kinetic energy, also holds deeper significance when examined critically. On one level, it is a brilliant technical accomplishment, blending actors, real crowds, and choreography into seamless tension. But on another, it becomes a metaphor for chaos and unpredictability. The protagonist navigates the throng, constantly reacting, constantly recalibrating. The scene mirrors life itself. The unpredictability of circumstance, the delicate balance between control and improvisation, and the ethical choices made under pressure. It is fascinating how the sequence operates on both levels simultaneously, providing visceral thrills while reinforcing the film's thematic core. The fortress finale, where all storylines converge, exemplifies how critical attention to events enhances appreciation of thematic depth. The collapsing structure, the betrayals, the final confrontations, they are not spectacle alone. They are a meditation on impermanence, responsibility, and moral reckoning. Every fall, every fracture of stone and trust, underscores the narrative's insistence on consequence. Actions cannot be undone, and resolution comes only at cost. From a critical perspective, the convergence of physical and emotional stakes is remarkable. The environment mirrors the ethical chaos, amplifying the impact of each decision. Watching it, I felt both exhilaration and sorrow, a duality that lingers long after the credits roll. The quiet aftermath, the protagonist alone in the crowded street, serves as a final critical punctuation. It is easy to mistake this for a simple denouement, but it is, in fact, the culmination of the film's emotional and thematic exploration. He is surrounded, yet isolated, visible, yet anonymous. Critically, this reinforces the film's central thesis. Reckoning is internal, ethical, and ultimately solitary. Victory is never public, and heroism is often private. That final image resonates precisely because it defies the expected spectacle of celebration, instead privileging reflection over applause. It is an audacious choice, one that elevates the story from entertainment to meditation. Another critical perspective emerges when considering the role of secondary characters. The wounded ally, the confidant, and the mysterious operative each function, not only as companions, but as ethical mirrors, revealing aspects of the protagonist's character and testing his moral compass. Critically, they are far more than plot devices. They are embodiments of conscience, loyalty, doubt, and temptation. Their arcs contribute to the story's depth, transforming what could have been a series of action set pieces into an exploration of relational and moral complexity. The narrative constantly returns to these relationships, signaling that no action exists in isolation, and that ethical judgment is inseparable from the web of human connection. The film's repeated exploration of the past, haunting the present further, enriches its critical profile. The whispered names, the recovered drives, the ghosts of prior decisions. Each of these events functions as both plot and metaphor. Critically, the narrative suggests that actions are never discrete, that history is never erased, and that ethical reckoning is an ongoing process. This resonates on both intellectual and emotional levels. Viewers are invited to reflect on their own pasts, their own unexamined choices, and the subtle ways in which memory shapes identity. It is rare for an action-driven story to foreground reflection so consistently, and that is part of what makes this film remarkable. Even the small, seemingly incidental events carry thematic weight. The spilled oranges in the marketplace, the flickering lamps in the safe house, the frozen camera in the snowstorm, all serve as reminders of unpredictability, chance, and human fragility. Critically, these moments reinforce the narrative's insistence that control is always provisional, that chaos is inherent to both life and story. They also heighten emotional resonance. We are drawn not only to what happens, but to how it happens, to the subtle textures of circumstance that render triumph, failure, and survival profoundly human. The score deserves critical attention as well. Composed partially with unconventional instruments and environmental sounds, it mirrors the narrative's emotional currents. The metallic groans, the echoes of desolation, the rhythm of footsteps and wind, they are not mere accompaniment, but narrative reinforcement. In a sense, the music becomes a character, guiding emotional response, signaling ethical tension, and amplifying both suspense and reflection. From a literary standpoint, one might compare it to the way motifs function in a novel, recurring, resonant, subtly shaping perception without ever intruding. Throughout, the film's use of time is critical. Scenes unfold not in linear perfection, but in a rhythm that echoes memory itself. Flashbacks, reverberations, repeated motifs. This temporal layering enhances thematic resonance, emphasizing the inescapability of past choices. Critically, the manipulation of time transforms the story from a sequence of events into a meditation on causality, consequence, and moral continuity. One leaves the film with not only memories of spectacle, but the lingering impression of ethical inquiry, of reflection on how the past permeates the present. In sum, the film's significant events, chases, confrontations, revelations, are inseparable from their thematic and emotional weight. Each sequence, while thrilling in action, functions on multiple levels: ethical, emotional, philosophical. The rooftop leaps reflect vulnerability and choice. The mountains evoke endurance and reflection. The desert portrays isolation and accountability. The final confrontation dramatizes moral reckoning. Even minor details, such as flickering lights or spilled oranges, contribute to the film's layered resonance, reminding the viewer that narrative impact arises as much from subtlety as from spectacle. From a critical perspective, the film's reception can be understood not solely in terms of entertainment, but as a response to its moral and emotional architecture. Audiences respond to spectacle, yes, but they also respond to the complexity of character, the ambiguity of choice, the inevitability of consequence. This is a film that asks for thought, reflection, and emotional investment. It challenges the notion that action cinema need be shallow. Instead, it demonstrates that profound thematic resonance can coexist with thrilling set pieces. Even now, days later, I find myself returning to moments that seemed minor at first. A glance across a flickering lamplight, a stumble in the sand, a hand offered and refused. Each carries an emotional weight that grows over time, a slow accumulation of resonance that mirrors the way literature often lingers. Critically, one sees that the film's true power lies not in what is visible on the surface, but in the patterns beneath, in the ethical questions it leaves unanswered, in the solitude and reflection it inspires. In that sense, the events of the film are inseparable from their impact. They are both narrative and meditation, spectacle and philosophy. And the film's enduring resonance emerges from the way it blends action with contemplation, thrill with introspection, plot with moral inquiry. It reminds us that stories endure not only through the events they depict, but through the reflections, questions, and emotional echoes they leave behind. When I think about the creation of a film, I often imagine it as a living organism, breathing and shifting in ways that defy the neatness of scripts and schedules. This one in particular seemed alive, almost willful. The production itself became part of the story, a tapestry of accidents, improvisation, and human ingenuity. What fascinates me most are the small details, the whispers of crew members, the unexpected occurrences that later shaped the narrative in ways no one could have predicted. One of the first things that struck me was the director's obsessive commitment to authenticity. He insisted on shooting many sequences in real locations, even when this choice introduced enormous challenges. The snowbound mountains, for instance, were not CGI or studio sets. The team scaled peaks where avalanches were a real threat, and temperatures often fell far below freezing. Crew members recall days when cameras would freeze mid-take, or lenses would fog over with ice, yet the director refused to compromise the vision. He argued that the rawness of the environment was inseparable from the emotional truth of the story. In interviews, he likened it to painting with uncooperative watercolors. The cold, the snow, the wind were all pigments contributing to the final picture. I love that metaphor because it captures a truth about filmmaking. Control is always partial, and brilliance often emerges from surrendering to circumstance. The opera house sequences hold their own law. The building was scheduled for renovation, yet the production secured only a few days to film. Crew members recount how the acoustics played tricks on them. Microphones picked up conversations from distant corners, footsteps echoed unpredictably, and a single whisper could travel across the entire stage. Actors described a sensation of being watched, not by cameras, but by the structure itself. Some even joked that the building was alive, conspiring to make them perform better. The final footage reflects this peculiarity. Shadows seem to move with their own intention, and the ambient sound carries an eerie resonance, enhancing the dramatic tension in ways that could never have been fully scripted. Then there's the story of the marketplace chase, one of my personal favorite behind-the-scenes tales. Unlike typical crowd scenes, this sequence relied heavily on improvisation. Many of the people captured on camera were not extras but passers-by, unaware they were part of the filming. One man carrying groceries collided with the protagonist during a take, spilling oranges across the cobblestones. The actor reacted instinctively, weaving the accident into the scene, and the director decided to keep it. This unscripted moment became emblematic of the production's philosophy: embrace chaos and let authenticity guide storytelling. In many ways, it is a reminder that cinema thrives when unpredictability is welcomed rather than resisted. The desert sequences are perhaps the clearest illustration of this ethos. Originally intended as a minor transitional scene, the desert became central to the film after the crew experienced its challenges firsthand. Sandstorms obliterated sets overnight, vehicles became stuck in dunes, and temperatures soared to extremes. Equipment frequently malfunctioned, yet these difficulties led to some of the film's most striking imagery. The protagonist trudging alone, his isolation amplified by the unforgiving landscape. Crew members recall long nights sitting around campfires, sharing stories of near misses and improvisations, aware that the desert itself had become a silent co-director. Watching the final footage, I felt the weight of that struggle. It is tangible in every frame, a reminder that production difficulties often enrich the narrative rather than diminish it. The snow sequences carry similar lore. On one occasion, a key scene involved the protagonist climbing a treacherous cliff as a blizzard swept across the set. The actor had to be secured with harnesses, yet the harness snapped during a take. Miraculously, he maintained his grip, and the cameraman captured the moment. It was so thrilling, so perilous, that the director kept it in the final cut. Crew members later joked that the snow had its own agency, almost as if nature itself had decided who would survive the scene. This anecdote illustrates the way production can blur the line between accident and artistry, creating moments that feel miraculous because they were earned through real danger and effort. The antagonist's performance carries its own behind-the-scenes story. The actor initially refused the role, claiming it was too emotionally intense, too personal. But after dreaming the character into being, they accepted and approached the role with extraordinary dedication. Crew members describe intense rehearsals in which the actor would remain in character for hours, internalizing past grievances and betrayals as though lived experience were fueling performance. The intensity was such that other actors sometimes struggled to maintain composure on set. The result is a portrayal that feels lived in, haunted, and utterly believable. From a production perspective, it demonstrates the interplay between actor psychology and narrative depth, and how commitment can elevate performance beyond what is written on the page. A quirky anecdote involves the safe house scene, where the wounded ally lies on a cot under flickering lamplight. The flickering was unintentional. The generator kept failing, but the director insisted the cameras keep rolling. This forced actors to navigate changing light conditions organically, resulting in moments of heightened tension and authenticity. Crew members later noted that they had never seen shadows dance so unpredictably in any staged scene. It's a reminder that even technical failures can become poetic if embraced rather than corrected. The production team also innovated in unexpected ways. For the film's score, they incorporated environmental sounds and unconventional instruments, including scrap metal and rusted pipes found on location. Sound designers would wander sets, hitting objects to create textures that could not be synthesized. These sounds were woven into musical themes, giving the score an organic, slightly uncanny texture. When I first heard it, I was struck by its strangeness. The music felt familiar yet alien, perfectly mirroring the narrative's moral and emotional ambiguities. Production diaries reveal that many of these recordings were serendipitous. Sounds captured while trying to fix technical problems, later discovered to be artistically invaluable. Even minor details on set carry stories. The prop department went to great lengths to ensure authenticity. Letters, objects, and personal artifacts were designed to reflect history, personality, and narrative subtext. In one remarkable case, a single photograph on a character's desk contained a hidden message in its frame, a clue to a subplot not immediately apparent to the audience. Crew members described the delight of discovering such Easter eggs in editing, realizing that small touches could enrich the story in ways few viewers would consciously notice, but all would feel subconsciously. One of the more amusing anecdotes involves catering. During desert sequences, food often spoiled in the heat, leading to creative improvisation. One day, the production team discovered they were out of water, and extras were starting to complain. Rather than delay filming, the director ordered the scene to continue, using the actors' dehydration-induced weariness to heighten realism. Crew members laughed later, recognizing that the actors' fatigue contributed to a haunting authenticity that no amount of rehearsal could have replicated. The logistical challenges of filmmaking, it seems, can unexpectedly enhance artistic impact. The fortress sequences required elaborate sets, many of which were constructed under tight schedules. Crew members recount that during construction, the walls shifted slightly under the weight of equipment, requiring on-the-fly adjustments. One camera rig tipped precariously, narrowly missing a stunt performer. These incidents added urgency and improvisation, forcing the team to think creatively. Interestingly, the slight imperfections in set alignment created shadows and angles that were kept in the final cut, contributing to a sense of instability and danger that perfectly matched the story's climax. Practical effects, too, were a source of creative ingenuity. During one snow sequence, a gust of wind blew debris into the camera lens, creating unexpected streaks that initially frustrated the cinematographer. Yet the director loved the effect, claiming it captured the chaos and unpredictability of the protagonist's journey. This openness to accident mirrors other production choices throughout the film. Rather than resist imperfections, the team integrated them into the visual language. It reminded me, as someone who writes fiction, that serendipity often shapes narrative texture as much as intention. The actor's preparation itself is a story worth noting. For sequences involving complex stunts, performers underwent rigorous training, not only in physical skill, but also in emotional endurance. Crew members recall the grueling schedule of rehearsals. Early mornings on icy mountains, long hours in deserts, repeated takes under extreme conditions. Yet, amidst the exhaustion, there were moments of humor and camaraderie, practical jokes, shared meals, and spontaneous music sessions. These moments of levity, I think, seeped into the final film, giving characters a humanity that could not be fully scripted. Even wardrobe had its peculiarities. Costumes were designed for both aesthetic and practical reasons, yet small choices sometimes had unintended effects. For example, the protagonist's jacket, made of heavy fabric to endure harsh environments, would occasionally snag on equipment, causing minor delays. Crew members eventually noted that these interruptions allowed the actor to react naturally, resulting in subtle gestures of frustration and improvisation that enriched character authenticity. Small accidents, it seems, are a recurring theme in the production story. Another anecdote involves the cinematographer, who devised a method for capturing certain high-risk sequences without endangering performers. Using remote-controlled cameras mounted on drones and cables, he was able to track motion across vast landscapes, including the snowy peaks and desert dunes. Crew members described these shots as exhilarating to watch during filming, often prompting spontaneous cheers on set. From a production standpoint, these innovations highlight the interplay between creativity and technology. Sometimes necessity inspires brilliance. Even editing carried its own behind-the-scenes tales. One sequence, involving a delicate emotional revelation, was initially cut incorrectly, disrupting narrative flow. The editor discovered a backup reel that had been misplaced weeks prior. Restoring it required patience, intuition, and an intimate understanding of pacing. Crew members described the moment of realization as almost magical. The scene, once restored, created emotional resonance far beyond the original plan. It underscores a principle of filmmaking I find endlessly fascinating: that editing is as much a creative act as writing or directing, capable of transforming chaos into coherence. There were lighter, human moments, too. During long desert shoots, crew members fashioned impromptu games with props to relieve boredom. One day, a stunt coordinator orchestrated a makeshift competition involving sand dunes and mock weaponry, eliciting laughter that echoed across the barren landscape. Actors and crew alike later remarked that these moments of levity strengthened team cohesion, contributing to a collaborative energy that permeated the final product. Finally, the production's attention to seemingly minor details imbued the film with layers of meaning. Props, lighting, and background action were often selected for symbolic resonance. The flicker of a lamplight signaling moral uncertainty, the placement of a photograph hinting at hidden history, the movement of shadows echoing narrative tension. Crew members recall debates lasting hours over the positioning of a single object, recognizing that small choices could amplify thematic depth in ways that would subtly influence audience perception. Taken together, these production stories reveal a remarkable truth. Filmmaking is an interplay of intention, improvisation, accident, and human creativity. Every mishap, every challenge, every improvisation shaped the final narrative. Watching the film, knowing these anecdotes, I felt as though I could sense the heartbeat of the crew within the story itself. Their ingenuity, endurance, and occasional humor are woven into every frame, giving the film a vitality that transcends its scripted narrative. Perhaps the strangest and most wonderful fact is that despite these challenges, freezing temperatures, shifting walls, misplaced reels, and improvised crowd scenes, the production maintained cohesion and vision. It is a testament to the resilience and creativity of the team, and a reminder that art is often forged in the furnace of difficulty. When I watch the final film, I see more than a story unfolding. I see the human effort, the problem-solving, and the serendipitous brilliance that brought it to life. It is these behind-the-scenes stories that make the film linger in my memory as much as the plot itself. The production is, in a sense, a parallel narrative, a story of collaboration, risk, improvisation, and invention. And just as the characters on screen navigate obstacles and confront consequences, the crew navigated the unpredictable terrain of filmmaking, shaping a work that is both thrilling and profoundly human. The first thing that struck me when considering the film's settings was how alive they felt, as though every location existed not just to host the story, but to participate in it. In cinema, a setting is rarely neutral. It carries tone, evokes emotion, and often acts as an unspoken character. From the icy peaks of distant mountains to the sun-scorched expanse of a desert, the film's environments are meticulously chosen and rendered to mirror the narrative's psychological and ethical contours. They are landscapes of both external danger and internal reflection. The snow-covered mountains, for instance, are breathtaking not merely because of their physical grandeur, but because of their narrative resonance. Each jagged peak and treacherous slope seems to mirror the protagonist's own precarious journey. I recall the way the camera lingers on the wind whipping across ice-strewn ledges, capturing not only the peril of the moment, but the isolating chill that accompanies ethical and personal reckoning. It reminded me of reading passages in literature where landscapes are inseparable from character psychology. The storm at sea, the vast desert, the mountain that must be climbed as a test of moral and physical endurance. Cinematically, these mountains are shot with wide, panoramic lenses that emphasize scale, dwarfing the human figures and reinforcing the idea that the forces the protagonist faces are larger than any single individual. Yet, in contrast, close-up shots capture the strain in his hands, the determination in his eyes, reminding the audience that courage exists not in abstract heroism, but in the intimate confrontation of fear. I was fascinated by the deliberate contrasts in settings throughout the film. The mountains are vast and unforgiving, but the urban sequences, particularly the rooftop chase, are tight and claustrophobic. Cinematography here employs long tracking shots interspersed with sudden cuts, emphasizing both movement and tension. The cityscape is lit with stark contrasts between shadowed alleys and sunlit rooftops, visually reinforcing the thematic interplay of secrecy, exposure, and moral ambiguity. The city is a maze, a place of constant negotiation between freedom and entrapment, a visual metaphor for the protagonist's own navigation of ethical dilemmas. The way the camera swings with the chase, sometimes disorienting the viewer, mirrors the uncertainty the protagonist must confront in each leap, each decision, each encounter. The opera house, in contrast, introduces a refined, almost ethereal atmosphere. Golden light floods the gilded balconies, velvet curtains ripple in imagined wind, and every reflective surface seems to echo not only sound but memory. The setting enhances tension in ways both subtle and profound. Cinematic techniques, tracking shots along corridors, tight close-ups of whispered conversations, and careful framing of shadows, transform the space into a moral labyrinth. Here, setting, light, and camera movement converge to produce an atmosphere that is almost hallucinatory, where every gesture and glance feels loaded with consequence. It reminded me of Gothic literature, where architecture and environment serve not merely as backdrop, but as emotional and symbolic agent. The desert sequences stand out for their stark simplicity and existential weight. Here, the cinematography embraces wide-angle shots and long, lingering takes, allowing the viewer to absorb the relentless emptiness. The heat shimmers in the mirage-like horizon, and the sand dunes ripple as though breathing. These shots serve a dual purpose. They convey isolation and struggle, and they elevate the protagonist's journey to near-mythic dimensions. Critically, the desert operates as a visual metaphor for the consequences of past actions. The vastness of moral terrain one must navigate, where every step carries weight and misstep can be fatal. Cinematographically, the sun and shadows are manipulated to create a subtle rhythm. The protagonist's progress is measured not only in distance, but in light, as if the very day itself marks his ethical reckoning. I found myself thinking of literary deserts, of the wandering pilgrim, or hero whose journey through emptiness is as much spiritual as physical. The fortress finale is perhaps the film's most intricate exercise in the interplay of setting and narrative tension. Massive stone walls, looming towers, and winding corridors are captured with low-angle shots, enhancing a sense of foreboding and immensity. Lighting here is particularly striking. Flickering torches and intermittent artificial light create moving patterns of shadow and revelation. The fortress, like the opera house, acts almost as a character, one that imposes both physical and moral challenge. The camera's movement through corridors, often following the protagonist in tight, suspenseful tracking shots, generates a sense of entrapment even amidst expansive spaces. Every stairwell, every broken arch, every hidden passage communicates history, danger, and consequence. Production design here is meticulous. Graffiti, debris, and subtle damage suggest prior conflict, layering the setting with a sense of lived experience and narrative depth. Even minor locations are treated with profound attention to detail. The safe house, dimly lit and cluttered with personal artifacts, creates intimacy and moral reflection. Warm light spills from worn lamps, casting gentle shadows on furniture and scattered objects. Cinematography emphasizes texture and proximity. Close-ups of hands touching maps, pages turning, subtle shifts in expression. These details, while small, enhance the atmosphere of quiet tension, suggesting that not every battle is fought with violence. Some occur within conscience and memory. I found these intimate spaces particularly compelling because they balance the grandeur of epic locations, anchoring the story in human scale. The film's visual language is reinforced by color grading and light manipulation. Snowy sequences are often muted, dominated by shades of white, blue, and gray, reinforcing coldness, isolation, and reflection. In contrast, the urban sequences employ warmer tones interspersed with harsh shadows, creating a visual tension that mirrors narrative uncertainty. The desert's golds and ochres evoke both heat and moral starkness, while the fortress and opera house use gilded and muted palettes to suggest history, gravitas, and consequence. Cinematically, the choices in color reinforce narrative tone. They are not merely aesthetic, but deeply integrated with story and theme. I often found myself pausing on frames, observing how the interplay of shadow, light, and hue conveyed emotional undercurrents that dialogue alone could not capture. Camera movement, too, deserves attention. Tracking shots, crane movements, and subtle handheld sequences are deployed to reflect emotional and narrative dynamics. The rooftop chase is frenetic, almost disorienting, using long, continuous shots to immerse the audience in the protagonist's peril and agility. Conversely, moments of reflection, such as the desert traversal or the quiet aftermath in the safe house, use slower, lingering shots to allow viewers to inhabit the psychological space. This interplay of kinetic and contemplative cinematography creates a rhythm that mirrors human consciousness, alternately urgent, reflective, and haunted by memory. Sound design interacts with setting to enhance atmosphere. The howl of wind in the mountains, the creak of old floors in the opera house, the shifting sands in the desert. Each environmental element is captured, amplified, and integrated into the soundtrack. These elements are not mere background. They function narratively, signaling danger, isolation, or reflection. In critical terms, the film demonstrates how audio and visual elements converge to create immersive spaces, where setting is inseparable from emotional and ethical engagement. Even the smallest props interact with setting to reinforce cinematic effect. A single photograph on a wall, a flickering lamp, or a scattered map becomes a node of tension and reflection. Production design ensures that every object feels purposeful, whether to suggest character backstory, hint at plot developments, or reinforce mood. When I watch these moments, I am reminded of literary descriptions of objects that carry symbolic weight, each artifact a vessel of memory, choice, and consequence. Cinematically, the care in positioning and lighting transforms mundane objects into narrative catalysts. One striking sequence involves a blizzard at the mountain pass. Cinematographers used a combination of natural snowfall and subtle visual effects to create a sense of overwhelming scale. The camera alternates between wide shots showing the protagonist dwarfed by the landscape and close-ups of his struggle, emphasizing both physical peril and internal perseverance. The combination of environmental authenticity and cinematographic technique elevates the sequence from spectacle to thematic meditation. It is not merely survival that is at stake, but moral and ethical endurance. The interplay of scale, light, and movement is masterful, creating tension and resonance that lingers long after the scene ends. Urban rooftop sequences employ a different visual grammar. Tight framing, shifting angles, and vertical compositions emphasize height, precariousness, and tension. The city becomes a psychological landscape, reflecting uncertainty, agility, and moral ambiguity. Shadows dominate corridors and alleyways, while sunlit rooftops contrast sharply, creating a visual dialectic between exposure and concealment, freedom and entrapment. The protagonist's movements across this landscape are choreographed and captured in a way that heightens both kinetic energy and thematic depth. In literary terms, it is akin to navigating a maze of ethical choices, each leap fraught with consequence. The Fortress finale is a masterclass in the orchestration of space, light, and action. Corridors twist and turn, creating tension and unpredictability. Staggered lighting and shadows amplify danger, while low-angle shots convey the imposing nature of architecture. Cinematographers play with depth of field, emphasizing both proximity and distance, intimacy and scale. The Fortress is both trap and trial, echoing thematic concerns of legacy, consequence, and moral reckoning. The combination of set design, lighting, and cinematography transforms a physical space into a narrative and psychological crucible, making the climax resonate on multiple levels. In quieter moments, the film excels in the interplay between setting and introspection. The safe house, the dim streets, the abandoned corridors, each location provides a reflective pause. Cinematographers use soft focus, gentle tracking, and ambient lighting to encourage observation of subtle expression, gesture, and dialogue. These sequences are crucial, demonstrating how setting can shape mood, enhance emotional resonance, and deepen narrative understanding. They remind viewers that not every story beat requires spectacle. Sometimes, the weight of place and the cadence of observation are enough to evoke profound response. Even fleeting locations contribute to atmosphere. A cafe, a train platform, a marketplace, all are captured with deliberate framing, light, and movement. These spaces, while small, feel lived in and meaningful. Cinematography emphasizes texture, background motion, and ambient sound, turning ordinary spaces into narrative touchstones. The result is a film where every setting, major or minor, carries thematic weight, adding to the immersive experience and reinforcing character psychology. Lighting and color design are used with remarkable sophistication. Cool tones in snow and night sequences evoke isolation, while warm hues in indoor locations suggest intimacy or moral reflection. Shadows are manipulated not merely for suspense, but for narrative commentary. A flicker of shadow may hint at duplicity. A sudden shaft of light may illuminate hidden truth. Cinematographers integrate these elements seamlessly, so that visual and thematic meaning coalesce naturally. I found myself returning to frames again and again, noticing the subtle interplay of light, shadow, and hue that guides emotional and ethical interpretation. Even the smallest visual motifs recur to reinforce setting and theme. Reflections in water, the movement of wind across sand, the sway of curtains, or the ripple of snow all echo narrative rhythms. These motifs link disparate locations, creating continuity in visual and thematic language. The result is a film where every cinematic choice, from camera angle to color palette to environmental texture, serves story, mood, and meaning simultaneously. The film's visual and spatial complexity contributes directly to its emotional and intellectual impact. Settings are not passive. They challenge, reflect, and illuminate character. Cinematography turns location into metaphor, guiding audience perception and emotional response. Even when the protagonist is absent, the environment communicates threat, possibility, or reflection. Critically, this demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of cinematic language. Mood, tone, and ethical resonance are embedded in visual and spatial choices, not simply conveyed through dialogue or action. The desert, mountains, city, fortress, and intimate interiors all operate as interlocking elements, forming a coherent visual and thematic architecture. Each location contributes to story, character, and tone. Cinematography, production design, lighting, and sound converge to make each environment vivid, immersive, and meaningful. As a viewer, I found that the film's power lay as much in its settings and visual language as in its plot or performance. The world feels lived in, morally weighted, and aesthetically precise, creating a cinematic experience that is both thrilling and intellectually engaging. Ultimately, the film demonstrates how setting and cinematography can elevate narrative from entertainment to reflection. Locations are not mere backdrops. They are instruments of storytelling, shaping mood, theme, and character perception. Visual and spatial choices, composition, light, shadow, scale, movement, color, and texture interact to create an immersive emotional and intellectual experience. As I watched, I realized that the true artistry of the film lies not only in what happens, but in where it happens and how it is captured. The world of the film is inseparable from its story, a living, breathing canvas for action, reflection, and ethical exploration. There's something magical about the moments that happen behind the camera, the moments that never appear on screen, yet somehow seep into the very soul of a film. When I think about the making of this story, I realize that much of its vitality comes from these invisible threads. The laughter shared between takes, the quick improvisations that salvaged sequences, the ingenuity demanded by impossible circumstances. Behind every breathtaking shot, there exists a web of human effort, ingenuity, and serendipity that is fascinating in itself. One of the earliest anecdotes that caught my attention involves the snow-covered mountains. The production team had planned an ambitious sequence of the protagonist scaling icy cliffs under a blizzard. On the first day, a sudden snowstorm made the climb more treacherous than anticipated. Cameras froze, harnesses snapped, and visibility dropped to a few feet. Yet instead of halting the shoot, the director encouraged the crew to embrace the conditions. Actors were bundled in thermal layers, stunt coordinators improvised safety protocols, and cameramen used handheld rigs to capture raw, kinetic shots. Crew members later recounted how the actors' genuine struggle and exhaustion, captured in real time, gave the scenes an authenticity that could never have been staged. The accident of weather became a collaborator in storytelling, shaping the narrative in ways no storyboard could predict. Then there's the opera house sequence, which has since become legendary among the production team. The building was scheduled for renovation, and only available for a few days. Crew members described navigating narrow corridors, ornate balconies, and echoing chambers while managing cameras, lighting, and sound. But the acoustics had a life of their own. A whispered line intended for a single microphone would bounce across the hall, creating overlapping echoes.